So moving on from the civil rights era elements of the 1960s, let's talk about the escalation of Vietnam. This map right above me is the post-French occupation map. So when the treaty was signed at the end of the French occupation, obviously we have North Vietnam, we have South Vietnam, um, and the United States have been supporting South Vietnam since the 1950s under Dwight Eisenhower. When Lyndon Johnson takes office, there had already been increasing escalation through the Kennedy administration, and there was that fear of the domino effect. So they didn't want North Vietnam to finally defeat South Vietnam. And later, it's found out that Lyndon Johnson and his staff sort of make up stuff that's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So up here on the map, you can see the Gulf of Tonkin right over here by North Vietnam. American ships were in the Gulf of Tonkin, and Lyndon Johnson and his staff said that the North Vietnamese had attacked American vessels. So they asked for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They wanted to escalate the Vietnam War by sending more troops in there. So this questionable information led the Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or the Tonkin Gulf resolution over here. And that allowed the president to use troops without actually having to ask for a declaration of war. And Johnson ends up sending 500,000 soldiers, 500,000 troops over the next 2 years into South Vietnam. Now, technically, they were not invading North Vietnam, but they're going to be fighting quite a lot in South Vietnam. What they thought was their safe zone against guerrilla warfare, the Viet Cong, right? So the North Vietnamese were the Viet Minh. The South Vietnamese supporters of the North were called the Viet Cong. And the United States is going to be fighting even within their supposed allied territory. Again, this is all part of the containment policy. It's part of the domino theory. You can see Uncle Sam here trying to stop the fall of South Vietnam so that Cambodia and then Laos and then the rest of East Asia don't fall to communism, because eventually those dominoes will lead to the United States. Now, important thing to recognize here about Vietnam is that it was not universally supported within the United States. There's a growing youth resistance movement because, one, they didn't like the draft. They didn't think the draft was fair. One, it's a male draft. Two, you could get out of the draft for a number of reasons. The biggest possible way to get out of the draft was by going to college, which only the wealthy folks could do. So poor people and minority populations tended to be more reliably drafted. You could also get out of the draft by entering the National Guard, which was very hard to do. You had to have political connections, which also meant the wealthy were able to get into the National Guard. Or a lot of people, like former President Bill Clinton, went to Canada to avoid the draft as well. So they didn't like the draft. Many of the youth saw this as an imperialistic war, that the United States was trying to take its own colonies. Remember, going back to the age of American imperialism, that idea of occupying foreign lands. So they thought this was a war of imperialism. And a lot of the youth wanted to focus on the issues in the United States, like the civil rights movement. Interestingly, television played a big role in shaping the views and perceptions of not only the Vietnamese War, but also the civil rights movement. So you can see here, this is Dan Rather. He's going to be, throughout the 1980s and 90s, he was a very important newscaster. Here he's actually in Vietnam broadcasting. You can see the soldiers in the back are about to go on a mission. So this leads to a lot of protest, and you can see here, bring the troops home now, and down here, we won't fight another rich man's war. And that's actually veterans that were opposed to the war. The Vietnam protests start to look an awful lot like the civil rights protests. Television played a big role in that. I think what's interesting is the way that the civil rights movement and the Vietnam protests do begin to merge. And we can see that really focused really well in Muhammad Ali, who refused to register for the draft or refused to participate in the draft on religious grounds. Muhammad Ali was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he refused to be drafted as a conscientious objector, so that it violated his religious beliefs. And what I think is interesting is the quote that he gives here about the reason he did this. He says, my conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America. And shoot them for what? They never called me the N word. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape, kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what? How can I shoot them poor people? So why is he not going to Vietnam? Well, you can see the civil rights movement being implemented here, right? The discussion of racism in the United States. They were never overtly racist to me. He's mentioning here the lynchings, the dogs. That's referring to the Birmingham campaign. Raping and killing my mother and father, stealing my nationality. That's an obvious reference to slavery. So he's saying, why would I support the Vietnam War when we have so much to do here in the United States to improve our race relations? Even Martin Luther King Jr. Said that Muhammad Ali, who is a member of the Nation of Islam, and Martin Luther King Jr. is a Christian pastor, Muhammad Ali puts it, we're all black and brown and poor, victims of the same system of oppression. And I think that's one of the things that really gets overlooked is the idea of systemic oppression, the idea that the system itself was the thing. You can get rid of it, well, not get rid of, you can get people to stop using the N-word. You can get people to stop being overtly racist to people. But if the system in place is promoting a racist view, then that becomes a lot harder to deal with. And we can see that in the end of the 60s, that's going to become a problem as well. Now, Muhammad Ali was stripped of his heavyweight boxing championship. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for refusing the draft, which eventually gets overturned by the Supreme Court. But even after 2.5 years after the Supreme Court decision, he had been out of the sport for 2.5 years, and it was hard for him to make that comeback. Anyways, by January of 1968, on the night of Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year, it's a religious holiday. The United States, for several years now, after this massive buildup by Lyndon Johnson, had been claiming on television and other places that they were winning the war. They had this thing called a body count, where they would show how many more Americans, how many more Vietnamese had been killed by Americans than Americans had been killed by Vietnamese. And they said, see, we're winning. Eventually, their resolve will crumble and the United States will be victorious. And then the night of Tet happens. And it is a massive coordinated attack throughout all of South Vietnam. Again, the Americans' safe spot on the same time, at the same night, on a holiday, and it's televised. Viewers could see all of this failure in real time. And even though the United States does repel most of these invasions, the fact that each one of these little red dots on this map occurred after 2 years where the United States thought they were winning, it turns public opinion against the war, and people start calling for the war to end, and they just want their soldiers and their sons and their husbands back home. Lyndon Johnson is haunted by the specter of this war. You can see Lyndon Johnson here, and you can see the ghosts of Vietnam above him, and he is severely damaged politically by the Vietnam War. His popularity plummets, especially after the Tet Offensive. And he is so unpopular, he chooses not to run for re-election in 1968, even though he was eligible to run. He tries to sacrifice himself so that the Democratic Party might be able to have a chance. But as we said, between Vietnam and the fact that Lyndon Johnson acknowledged that by signing the Civil Rights Act, that the Southerners weren't going to vote for Democrats, and for, he said, a generation. We're now going on about 3 generations later. We get the end of Lyndon Johnson's political party. And really, by 1968, moderate white Americans were starting to get tired of the radical 60s. Those moderate white Americans that had supported, some of the things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Now things are getting harder. Black leaders were pushing for more difficult change by the end of the 60s. They were pushing for not just laws promoting legal equality, but also economic equality, social equality. And you can't just pass a law for that. You need people to be self-reflective and think about their own behaviors and change themselves. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr.'s last speech had nothing to do with the Civil Rights Act. It was about promoting economic equality. He was talking to, I believe it was a garbage workers union before he was assassinated. And this can best be seen here in South Carolina. In 1968, the South Carolina State University, I believe, which is a historically black college, suffers the Orangeburg Massacre. And state troopers, you can see this is the article here. Notice the passive voice. Passive voice is often used in newspapers when they don't want to blame anybody for anything. So they say, all hell breaks loose, 3 killed, many wounded in a college nightmare. But they don't say what happened, right? And at the Orangeburg Massacre, students were protesting segregation of a bowling alley, of all places, in 1968, 3 years after these public areas were supposed to be integrated. The students were protesting, and there's a fear that the students might damage the property. So the emergency workers brought in a fire truck. After 10 years of seeing that fire trucks were often used against the protesters, along with dogs, there was an increase in tension by that. The students go back to their campus. They're still angry. They decide to tear down an old shed, and they tear that old shed down and they burn it in the middle of the road. Meanwhile, state troopers have ringed the campus. And as the students begin to make their way back to their dorm rooms, an incident happens where a police officer thinks that he's being attacked. And that leads all the officers to open fire on the students, killing 3 of them and wounding many others. Turns out that the officer was not being attacked. Something happened where a board fell off a broken down shed, something like that. But in the aftermath is what's interesting, right? Because we can probably talk about all of that pretty reasonably. But the aftermath of the Orangeburg Massacre is that it was largely ignored. All of the allies for the civil rights movement kind of wrote it off and said the kids probably had it coming to them, and they just let it go. That incident has lived on here in South Carolina, especially when you get more in the upstate. Anyways, the traumatic 1968 election really does have long-term consequences here. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. obviously was assassinated. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in 63, so this is about 5 years later. And his brother was running for election, Robert Kennedy, who had been John Kennedy's attorney general. He was pretty popular among the youth movement. He was seen as a civil rights advocate. He was assassinated on television. So you have these civil rights leaders being killed. You have protests over the Vietnam War. You have protests and all for the civil rights movement. And at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, anti-war protesters clashed with police officers and National Guardsmen outside of the Democratic National Convention, and things just look chaotic. And the Democratic Party didn't really recover from that. And the Miami Republican National Convention nominated Richard Nixon, and Nixon urged people in the what he called silent majority to support him in the election. Now, what he meant by silent majority were those moderate white voters that were tired of the civil rights movement, tired of all the anti-war protests, tired of having to change so much to accommodate the youth vote and to accommodate the other populations demanding rights. And Nixon wins, and he says it was because of the silent majority. And then he's going to implement some other changes we'll talk about in the next section. There it is.